Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out today to what I think will prove to be a fascinating conversation. I'm Nik Gvosdev. I direct the U.S. Global Engagement Program here at the Carnegie Council. We are assembling at a very interesting midpoint between two consequential meetings which may have a very big impact on the future direction of U.S. foreign policy. We've just completed what I think is probably the most contentious G7 summit really since maybe the 1970s or the early 1980s, and really putting the United States at odds with its closest economic and military partners. From that summit, the president is now in Singapore, and I assume at about 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time tonight is when he will have his face-to-face, one-on-one meeting with Kim Jong-un, and we'll see how that plays out. So we could really see some major shifts occurring in the direction of U.S. foreign policy, and certainly America's allies and partners, both in Europe and Asia, as well as America's competitors, are looking to see what the long-term impact of these meetings will be and what it portends for the future. This also raises the question and brings us back to our topic today. I don't know how many of you saw the photo that the German photographer took at the G7, which I think is now seen as the iconic summary of that meeting of kind of lecturing Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel of Germany, a more defensive President Trump with his arms crossed, and other G7 leaders ranged about. But what I have found very fascinating is that that image is a political Rorschach test in the United States in terms of how people are reacting to it. So you have some people saying this is terrible. Look, this shows that we have a major wedge with our allies, and the liberal order that the United States has shepherded for the last 70 years is coming to an end. And others are saying this shows the president standing up, and he's standing up for middle America against the rapacious trade practices of free-riding allies in Europe and Asia, and he's standing his ground. So this one image is being interpreted very differently. And it comes back to this question of expertise and trust, which is how do Americans validate policy choices? A number of people have said the G7 was not a success. Others have been saying it went very well. We obviously have the pundits on the cable news programs, particularly this past Sunday, spinning. But what is resonating? How do American voters and then how do American political leaders assess the direction of U.S. foreign policy, and where is the impact of these choices? And what is the basis of trust for saying that we trust the judgment? Or have we entered, as people like Tom Nichols have suggested in The Death of Expertise, we've entered this post-Google age where there is no expertise, and everyone feels that the internet allows them to possess all the information they may ever need on any subject, and there's no need for expertise. We'll have a real test of this for the president coming into Singapore this evening, tomorrow morning Singapore time, because the reports is that in the first meeting with Kim Jong-un, he will not have staff support, he will not have Korea experts with him, he will not have nuclear experts with him, and this sense that the two leaders, or at least the president, feels that perhaps he doesn't need expertise in order to conduct this, at least this first initial meeting with Kim Jong-un. To discuss this issue, we have brought two leading commentators on U.S. foreign policy. You have their bios in front of you. Kori Schake to my left, Colin Dueck to my right. Kori, in a way, provides three panelists for the price of one on this subject because of her background.
I was worried about what that noun was going to be.
What that noun was going to be? Yes. Because currently the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, a bona fide member of the expert community. Many of you may know her from her columns in Foreign Policy, the podcasts, or from a variety of her writings or her appearances. So she is a bona fide member of the expert community, but she has also been a practitioner at senior levels of the U.S. national security establishment, served as director of the policy planning staff, was a senior member of the National Security Council staff for strategic prioritization. So she has the practitioner expertise. But finally, you've also advised candidates. You've been involved in the nuts and bolts of trying to get people elected to office. So you understand the basis by which candidates have to be able to, it's not enough to say I have a great policy, you have to connect that to a majority of voters to say, please endorse this policy or endorse my candidate to carry out this policy. So in many ways, you are a three-in-one, expert, practitioner, and campaign expert. Not to then slight Colin, professor at George Mason University, probably one of the, I would say, leading analysts of American foreign policy, particularly of the last post-Cold War period, and specifically, Colin has really developed an in-depth appreciation and understanding of the debates and schisms within the Republican Party since the end of the Cold War, of both among Republican elites, but also among the Republican base, among the voters. What direction should policy go in? And we've seen these play out in the George H.W. Bush administration, in the George W. Bush administration, to what extent in the Trump administration these cleavages are still there, and then how this has also impacted in Democratic administrations as well. And for Colin, in some ways, this is a return to that first, Colin and I were together in Oxford at St. Anthony's College, and you may recall that seminar we convened at St. Anthony's after the unexpected upset in 1994 when 25 plus years of Democratic control of the House of Representatives was upended, and a lot of our British colleagues wanted to have a sense of what did this mean and what was this wave coming from the American heartland, and all of these familiar members of Congress and, more importantly, familiar congressional staff were disappearing and being replaced by people who were relatively either unknown or untested in foreign affairs. And I think it's a sort of a similar issue today, which is what's happening in the American heartland and among American voters, and are we entering into new territory? Let me just say that there's so much on the table. We're not going to be able to cover everything in one session, but I think we'll have a good conversation. I'll turn the floor over to Kori first, then to Colin, and then we'll open it up for general comments.
Thank you. So as Nick said, I sailed on the pirate ship McCain in 2008. I was John's defense advisor on his presidential campaign. And I think about that as where the tsunami we are living through now starts, both because of the way John chose Governor Palin, who in a lot of ways exemplifies the kind of reckless populism that we are seeing central to Republican Party politics right now, but also because it was the first campaign that had to take into account the two big failures of experts, the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis. And I think my answer to the question of can the American public regain its confidence in its national security approach is the American public's right. We were wrong about big, important things and reckless about the consequences, and they're sick of hearing it from us. And they're not wrong to be critical in that regard. That I think, so one big piece of what's happening is the genuine failure on the part of experts to think in a careful way about the consequences on the American heartland of a series of choices that have to do with kind of two big drivers, I think. And the two big drivers are the end of the Cold War and the go-go financial consequences of the information age. So let me start with the end of the Cold War. Simon Nixon, the Wall Street Journal's Europe guy, made my hair stand on end a couple of weeks ago by suggesting that, maybe we've got the time frame wrong on the end of the Cold War, right? Maybe we're mistaken to think the Cold War ends when the Soviet Union collapses, that maybe actually now, maybe that Renaissance painting from the G7 is when the Cold War ends. Because in the intervening 25 years, what you see is a United States that is growing more and more confident that it's got the right answers, that the arc of history is bending towards not just justice, but to that our values are universal, and we are unconstrained by the challenge of another great power. So it's not that, as President Trump says in his national security strategy, and as gets carried through to the Defense Department's national defense strategy, it's not that we're in an age of great power competition. It's that great power competition is the nature of the international order. What was different about the prior 25 years is there were no great powers to contend against us, right? All of the prosperous, strong countries of the international order were actually America's allies and aligned to how we would like the international order to work. So what we are looking at as the return of great power competition is in fact the return of another great power, right? The rise of China. And this enormous technological upheaval that I'm reasonably confident bodes well for our country and our friends in the world, because in the near term, authoritarian states have found really ruthless, creative ways to harness these technologies to social control. But I don't think that's the way to bet your money. Shocky's theory of authoritarianism is that there is no government so consistently good at its job over time that it can prevent my nephews from downloading pornography, right? The incentive structure is just aligned too strongly to my nephews. They are going to find a way around any kind of controls people can throw up. And that's the nature of the information age, right? All of us are walking around with supercomputers in our pocket. All of us can take pictures of police when they are carrying out their, or better yet, videos, when they are carrying out their function. And we're going to have a big, loud, typically disputatious American argument about everything that's going on. And that is, in fact, what we are doing right now. It feels incredibly enervating. It's exhausting, right? Like I'm yearning for a boring Midwestern governor to get elected president so that I can just stop paying attention to every day's indignation. But this revolution that we are going through, first of all, we started it, right? Which everybody always, Europeans always remind us. But second of all, these are fundamentally democratizing technologies. And they are going to benefit societies in which the government doesn't have all the power, where it will benefit people being able to hold authorities accountable. And in the longer term, that is enormously advantageous, not just to the United States, but to the values that we stand for and try and propagate in the world. The 2008 financial crisis is the other big driver. If you haven't yet read a book written by a pair of economists called This Time Will Be Different, it's a hard slog. It's 400 pages of economists talking, but it's really extraordinary. And what I drew from reading it is that there's never been a financial crisis that a country took less than 10 or 12 years to claw its way back out of. And if they are right, we are still in our domestic politics looking at the long shadow of the 2008 financial crisis. And in the Shocky Tribe, we have a near perfect political focus group. Namely, I have 32 cousins who live in rural Ohio outside of Cleveland. And talking to them in the run-up to the 2016 election, they don't want to hear it from foreign policy experts, they don't want to hear it from economists, and they don't want to hear it from the political establishment who they feel like has not solved their problems. Parenthetically, the they are predominantly lifelong Democrats who voted for John Kasich because he actually does care about the opioid crisis. He actually does care about junior college education. So interesting. In my boring Midwestern governor theory, I'm not sure John Kasich is that governor, but the great thing is that the experimentation that everybody's got going, because the president isn't the only person who's got to find a way to turn the key in this lock and address voter exasperation. And if you look at American polling about politicians, everybody hates Congress, everybody hates whatever president, past or present, but respect for local and state government is soaring in the United States. And that suggests to me that people think their local and state governments have a better handle on the problems that are genuinely worrying them. And that, of course, is why a federal structure of government is so advantageous, because everybody experiments. And we are a reckless political system, right? Every other democracy has sorting functions where elites can prevent reckless lunatics from catapulting to the top of the system. And it is both the great strength and the great weakness of the American political system that we don't. That anybody can get elected president, and that's just the risky run as a country. But that also ties our political system much more tightly to public attitudes, which is wonderful, right? I mean, the exasperation that Americans have, we actually have political means to address in the very near term. Midterm election, like nobody else has to go in front of voters every 2 years. And that's what makes our system both so melodramatic, but also so good at solving problems. The last thing I will say is that what President Trump has done extraordinarily well is ask basic first order questions. Why do we defend allies who don't appear willing to defend themselves? Why isn't trade policy more advantageous for American manufacturing? Now, I think the president lacks a grasp of basic economics. He doesn't seem to realize services comprise 73% of the American economy. But he's right to ask these first order questions. And it is the failure of people like me to answer them in a way that my Uncle Eddie finds satisfying in the midst of this revolution that is what's driving the upheaval in American politics. The good news is our political system is A, holding up really well in this time of craziness, and B, actually, we have the means to sort this, and everybody's busy trying to find a way to be the person who can answer that question, because that's what's going to get people elected this autumn and in 2020. And I think I'll stop there, my friend.
Thank you, Kori. Colin.
Okay, so I think the term that's come up a lot the last couple of years is liberal international order, or rules-based liberal international order. And it's this thing that we worry about, particularly academics, foreign policy experts, think tank, foundations, and some leading politicians, both here and overseas. And the fear, obviously, is that Trump is challenging the liberal international order, whatever that is. And this debate almost takes on a kind of theological quality at times. It's an ism, right? What does it mean? Normally, people use it to mean something beyond the US playing a leading role, but a set of rules, economic, diplomatic, that bind the US deliberately. But the term has actually drifted a little bit in its meaning over the years. So you want to ask yourself, for example, does it mean that we're talking about sovereign democracies cooperating with one another as allies, or does it mean that we're continually ceding sovereignty to transnational institutions? There is a genuine debate over that, for example, between left and right. But that's a legitimate debate. That's a debate that can happen between honest, well-intentioned people. Similarly, you could ask yourself, how dogmatic are we going to be about the regimes that need to populate that system? Do they need to look exactly like us? Or can we allow for more pluralism within that system? Can we allow, for example, for constitutional monarchies in the Middle East? There are some regimes in the Middle East that are allies of ours. They're not profoundly inhumane. They're also not Jeffersonian democracies, right? So Jordan, for example. Is that acceptable? Or do we have to insist that everybody looks just like us, right? That's another example of a legitimate debate. What's happened, I think, over the years, and Kori's right, is that the foreign policy expert community has narrowed what it considers to be the range of acceptable perspectives to the point where the general population, I think, has become very frustrated on multiple grounds. And this comes from both left and right. One of the things that's happened is obviously, whether it's through the Trump campaign or the Bernie Sanders campaign on the left, a lot of Americans just don't believe that this liberal order is serving their material interests when it comes to free trade and globalization. As it turns out, a lot of people, including in Ohio, believe that globalization has hurt them more than it's helped them. And that was a revelation to see that in 2016, not just on the left, but on the right, you could make that argument and win the Republican nomination, because we used to think that the orthodox Republican position was pro-free trade. As it turns out, you can have a candidate who comes along with a ferocious argument against free trade and wins the whole thing. So that blew us out of the water, right? And I can tell you from being on the other side of this, I was working for a different Republican candidate. What Donald Trump did was he identified a set of gaps between elite opinion and popular opinion on one issue after another. And he just drove through those gaps like a Mack truck, quite frankly, okay? As blunt as he could be. Free trade was one of them. Immigration was another. The standard view of Republican elites in DC is to sort of pay lip service to what Republican voters think, but in reality, Republican elites are pro-business. They favor more or less open immigration, traditionally, for decades. What the Republican voters were saying, many of them, is, we don't, right? We view this as a challenge. We view it as a challenge economically and maybe even culturally, right? Now, obviously, that's an issue where Bernie Sanders supporters feel very different, and that's an issue where there's a difference between left and right. However, as it turns out, there's also a difference between elites and public opinion on both sides. The elites of both parties tend to be more pro-immigration. The public opinion, the voters, the grassroots, particularly on the Republican side, is much less pro-immigration. It just is. And so if the elite of the party insists on a pro-immigration platform, eventually some political entrepreneur is going to come along and identify that gap and run with it. And Trump did that. Okay, so free trade was one, immigration is another. Foreign policy is a third. I remember quite vividly the moment where Trump said in one of the debates, I think it was in an exchange with Jeb Bush, that Iraq was a mistake. It was an unforgettable moment. Even if you weren't for Trump or working for Trump, even if you were actually working on a different Republican campaign, who else talked that way? Maybe Rand Paul, but he didn't have a chance, right? To have the front runner of the Republican Party say Iraq, and not just to say it, but to shout it, if you recall. He actually shouted it. He sounded angry. And I'm not questioning the sincerity or the insincerity of Trump's statement. I don't know what was really on his mind. But he said something, I guarantee you millions of Republicans at the grassroots level around the country felt the same way. Iraq was a mistake, right? That's how they felt. And here was somebody who actually had the guts to say so, right? My candidate didn't say that. So if the elite of the party was out of touch with the base of the party, somebody was going to discover that, right? So we have to ask ourselves, you know, what is it we're defending when we say liberal international order? I mean, what exactly are we defending? What's the concern? What's the worry? My own point of view, I think probably like Kori and Nick, is there is a core set of institutions that really are valuable and that have done a great deal of good. The fact that the US has a forward presence in the world, going back to the 1940s, that it supports allies, that it has democracies that it's nurtured over the years, starting with Germany and Japan, that it has trading arrangements with these countries. The world has been freer, more prosperous, safer as a result of that role. In my mind, there's no question about that. But there's been a set of kind of aggregations around that role, particularly since the end of the Cold War, that have frustrated a lot of people because they seem like a failure. And then you start to get candidates coming along who say, well, this isn't working, right? It's just not working. It's not in your interest. And then, of course, the risk is that you throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? So how do you preserve the baby? If the baby is America's forward role, we don't want to see that dismantled. We don't want to, for example, if NATO was to actually be dismantled, that opens up incredible opportunities for Vladimir Putin, right? That's not going to be a safer world. But how do we bolster NATO and meet what I think are actually some of the valid voter concerns, right? I mean, why doesn't Germany spend more on its own defense? Is that actually such an outrageous thing to say for an American citizen who's, let's say, lower middle class or working class in Ohio, I don't actually think that's such an invalid concern, right? Trump says it in a very blunt way, but it's probably how many Americans feel in both parties. You know, if you sort of reflect on it as a first order question, why doesn't Germany spend more on its own defense, right? So we're having a debate, and it's characteristically, it's lopsided, it's ferocious, sometimes it's unfair on all sides, right? It's all American, right? I mean, it's rambunctious. It's rambunctious, but it's a democratic debate, small d, Trump supporters, Trump critics, Democrats, Republicans. And I actually think it's useful. I think in the long run, like Kori suggested, this is going to be a useful time to knock open some previously unanswered questions or unasked questions and try to tackle them and say, well, what do we really believe? Because Trump is a kind of destructive force, right? He's a wrecking ball. He smashes things. His supporters actually like this about him and say, hopefully it's a creative destruction. Hopefully something good comes out of it, right? The people who are entirely worried about him don't see that possibility at all. But at a minimum, it's cleared the way, as a wrecking ball does, for something new. Trump may not be the one to rebuild something new in a way that's entirely constructive. And we don't know who will. Maybe it'll be a Democrat, maybe it'll be a Republican. The real question in my mind is what comes after Trump, right? Who's next? What's that foreign policy going to look like? Because I don't think we can go back to pre-Trump. I really don't. We cannot pretend that this hasn't happened. I really think that if elites in either party run in 2020 or 2024, just saying, I hate Trump, let's pretend this never happened, that's not going to fly. It's really not. We have got to digest what's happened intellectually, politically, try to understand whatever valid concerns there are, and then create something more constructive, over which there can be honest and well-intentioned disagreement. I'll stop there.
Let me just start by a framing question to both of you, and taking actually your closing point, Colin, and moving forward with it. So with the American expert community, is the American foreign and national security expert community, the American economic expert community, trade community, as we move into 2018, 2020, are they going to look at these trends and be, and I can't remember who the French politician was who said it, right? The mob is running in that direction, I must follow them in order to lead them, versus an expert community that says, we've gone off the rails, good first order questions, wrecking ball, but now we have to be constructive and we need to bring you back. You know, that there's an emotion, as you said, both of you said, there's a sense among a number of voters that the system hasn't worked, it hasn't served them. All right, you've had those feelings, but now we've got to bring you back to reality. What do you see, and particularly in your circles and among your contacts? Because I mean, the other lesson I think of the 2016 campaign was, and what we're seeing to this day, is that you have people who say, I want to speak truth to power, and then others who say, I want to cultivate power. Maybe I'll speak truth, or maybe I won't, because I hope to get in and then maybe shape from the inside. So what do you see happening with the expert community and American political leaders as we move forward?
Okay, and trying to shape from inside, by the way, can be an honorable choice.
Yes,
there are some perfectly capable, honorable people serving in the Trump administration right now. There's some who are first rate. But at the end of the day, Trump's made it clear as president that he, like any other president, is going to call the shots. And in his case, it's very clear. If when he imposes tariffs on Canada, that's his decision. It's not what the orthodox economist would recommend, and he knows it. So he doesn't have a lot of orthodox economists around him. So on the question of what would economists say, I was talking to a colleague and I asked him this very question down the hall at George Mason University. And he gave me a great economist answer, which was we should fan out, and he meant this in all sincerity, we should fan out into towns that are hurt by globalization and explain to them the benefits of globalization from an economist point of view. And I just sort of stood there and blinked at him and tried to be polite, and it just reminded me of why Donald Trump won the election. Because I mean, Trump is so much more persuasive and forceful and uncannily effective in the way he talks about these things. I mean, the truth is that, look, globalization does bring mutual gains, and economists know this, and they're very capable in explaining why. But it also creates winners and losers in a relative sense, okay? So, for example, a lot of working class or lower middle class Americans have not been, and some economists now say this, have not benefited as much proportionately as the wealthiest Americans, or for that matter, as the wealthiest or rising middle classes in other countries like China and India. So when Trump comes along and hits on that sense of that resentment, he's not wrong. Okay, now whether or not he has a positive program in relation to trade is a different question. He may not, right? But he hits on that resentment, and so a lot of people will say, that's the guy. He at least understands my complaints. He gets it, right? I haven't talked to anybody who gets it. He seems to get it. That's populism, right? That's a sense of being reconnected to popular concerns. So I'm pretty sure, I'm sorry to say, I'm pretty sure that the standard expert response is wrong, which is to say, let's go out and explain to the public once again why the public is wrong and the experts are right. I just don't, I mean, we've seen that just doesn't work. So there's got to be some way, and I'm not sure if this is the president to do it, but there's got to be some way of squaring the legitimate concerns that are out there, the concerns about the downside of globalization, the people that are hurt by globalization, the people that are displaced. And this is a revelation for Republicans, by the way, right? For Republicans to figure out, somebody like a Kasich, how do you talk about that and respond to it in a constructive way, in practical nitty-gritty terms? What policies do you pursue? And yet at the same time, without wrecking your alliances, without wrecking all the benefits from free trade and from this great system of allies we have overseas.
I want to really reinforce Colin's point about how we talk about it, because I think both in domestic politics and internationally, the condescension of elites and allies is a lot of what's driving the exasperation. So it's not just that Germany spends 1.2% of its GDP on defense, while wanting American soldiers deployed in Germany and an airtight guarantee for us. It's that Germany trumpets the superiority of its social welfare programs over ours and you Americans, right? It's the condescension of that conversation. And the same holds domestically, right? Like my cousin Larry said, I don't care that my TV's cheap. I have a 22-year-old son living in the basement who doesn't have a job. And thereby did I lose the argument about free trade, right? And so Colin's right. We actually have to approach this with empathy for the experience of our fellow Americans and solve their problems, which is what politics are supposed to do. We very often think, especially when we're talking about America's alliance relations, we very often mistakenly believe there were halcyon days in the past where American statesmen stood astride the world and didn't have grubby local political concerns to constrain them. And I don't see when that period was, right? Like, it was a big struggle for the Truman administration to get the Marshall Plan through Congress, and they made all sorts of disgraceful horse trading deals to get it through, and it was great for our country that we did. And it was great for a lot of other countries as well. So I think my sense is that how you have the conversation really matters, and elites, both domestic and international, have actually got to stop condescending to people who are genuinely worried about how the economy is changing and how the social fabric of the country is changing. And they're scared, and they're not wrong to be scared. So that's one thing. The second thing, it seems to me, about what's going on, I absolutely agree with Colin's diagnosis that President Trump, he speaks to things that other more polite politicians won't say out loud, but that people are actually feeling. And I, as a conservative, used to get exasperated with the Obama administration holding law class to explain to all of us lesser mortals about why their policy was the only one that could possibly, right? The nature of our discourse we need to actually be more acknowledging that our fellow Americans can disagree with us and still be right. The third thing that I would say, though, is that what I think I see in the polling about American public attitudes, in particular, the polling done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. They do an annual survey of American public attitudes on on global affairs. And last year, so a year into the Trump administration, they saw striking shifts in American attitudes on all of the president's big three, on allies, on immigration, and on trade. 15 percentage point swings in American attitudes over the course of a year. That's a tidal wave of changed attitudes. And in all three cases, the shift was in the opposite direction of the president's policies. And it's, it's too soon to tell is the honest answer. But my theory of the case is that what is happening is that the president is asking first order questions that everybody else was too polite to challenge or too much a part of the globalist elite of people like me to challenge. And it is making my cousin Larry and my Uncle Eddie pause and think about these issues in a way they haven't before. And that upon consideration of the big, loud, messy, angry public debate we are having, they are coming to conclusions that immigration is actually good for this country, and we don't want to be the people we see separating families at the border or bouncing out people who want to contribute to our society and who are the revitalization of how we think about ourselves as Americans. They actually, they don't like free trade in the abstract, but they do want an American economy that's humming along. And even among Republicans, you see a shift in favor of trade again. And lastly, on allies, you see the same thing. So one of the things I am eagerly watching is to see how polling responds to our president's shocking treatment of the Canadian Prime Minister and the fact that he was isolated among the 6 countries that are our closest friends and economic partners in the world. If, in particular, Republicans are okay with that, if John Bolton's retweet of that Renaissance painting of Merkel leaning on the table and the president isolated and obdurate, if Republicans think, as John Bolton tweeted out, yeah, our man's standing up for us, then actually this is going to be a very different conversation than if Republican reaction is, aren't those the guys who took in every American who was on an airplane after September 11th and took us into their homes? And don't we actually kind of like the people we have a 3,500-mile largely unguarded border with? We'll see. We're about to get a very interesting Rorschach test of where the Republican Party is. And it actually says a lot that I'm not prepared to bet my money on which side my fellow Republicans are going to come down on that. I'm sorry, one other thing I should have said. I'm going on too long. But the other big factor in this is the choices that my sister's political party is about to make, right? Because if Democrats have a landslide, first of all, that'll be data point 1 on the turn of the kaleidoscope about American politics, if Republicans are willing to cross the line and vote for Democrat. And of course, it always depends on who that Democrat is. If Republicans can resist the temptation to flock to the Bernie Sanders direction of the party and actually care about small businesses and speak a language that is going to draw Republicans across the line. And if, as is likely at the moment, Democrats retake the House, it'll matter a lot whether a Democratic-controlled House sends virtue signals and spends all their time talking about President Trump, or whether they have the discipline to actually have a legislative agenda that they pass and make a Republican-controlled Senate take a position on about how to solve the problems that my Uncle Eddie and Cousin Larry are experiencing.
Let's open it up. Please wait for the microphone. So, ma'am, we'll start with you, and then sir will go to you.
Susan Gittleson. This was so enlightening, and thank you for bringing in your family from the Midwest, because we don't often enough, many of us don't have relatives that we can ask about this. Let's ask a big question about national security, because aren't we seeing a shift from Eurocentric American foreign policy, following upon the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, although what is the role of Russia now, and the turn to Asia? North Korea, that little puny country, has so much power over us. And China, the giant, you're saying, is the opposite number now. So what is happening to American national security priorities?
Colin, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. You're right, there is a long-term shift. It's, I mean, very long-term. In a way, we're moving back to pre-1500, if we can wrap our heads around that. In other words, an era where Europe has been the center of the world. Even during the Cold War, Germany was kind of the ultimate prize, right? Now we're in a world where Europe is really secondary. It really, really is. Actually, this center of gravity has shifted to the Pacific. And China, just the sheer weight of China's economy is pulling everybody in, and it's creating security challenges for the US too, particularly as China converts that into political and military weight. So that's the number one long-term challenge, which in an odd way, I mean, Trump seems to believe on some level, right? Which is that we need to focus away from, and Obama did something similar, the pivot to Asia. So we're sort of fumbling toward this sense. I mean, Americans kind of have this feeling that China is now the number one challenge. It's not that people want to go to war with China, and China doesn't want to go to war with the US, but this is the number one challenge. So I think you're right. We're moving toward a world where it's going to be more Asia-centric, more Pacific-centered. That's frustrating for Europhiles and Atlanticists, right? And it's not to say that Europe isn't still a key center for American activity in the world, and the Middle East is a sort of third theater. But that's part of the challenge for what people call the liberal order, is how do you manage a liberal order when the single biggest actor in the Asia-Pacific is not liberal? I mean, China plays by its own rules. It's not going to play by our rules. They've made that very clear, and they have the power to resist and say, no, we'll push back. We'll play by our own rules. Massive industrial espionage, intellectual property theft, right? Territorial aggression in the nearby waters. You know, China can be pretty aggressive, even though it doesn't want open conflict with the US, and that's probably not going to go away. That'll be a challenge for whoever is president.
So I have a slightly different view than Colin on this one, which is I think it's still an open question whether China can continue to rise without liberalizing, and whether we are really willing to shift our interests to Asia. So let me take the two of them separately. First, so there has never been a country that has succeeded in becoming sustainably prosperous without becoming politically liberal, right? It's Hegel's philosophy in action, that as people have their basic needs met, they become more demanding political consumers. And China is, of course, the great outlier to that, because for the last 40 years, they have been becoming more and more prosperous, and there doesn't appear to be any important alternative power center arguing for liberalization. The space I would watch, I am watching, and I encourage you to watch about how this plays out, is that I think what is going to force the liberalization of the Chinese government is moms demanding safe baby milk, right? Because in an authoritarian society where power is concentrated so tightly at the top, and there are none of the canary in the coal mine mechanisms that free societies have, investigative journalists, local government demanding the federal government do its job right, elections. You have an enormous stream. Hong Kong has just put limits on the number of mainland Chinese who can transit into Hong Kong because they are buying all the safe baby milk, because people on mainland China have no confidence that their government is keeping their food safe, right? That's a classic rich world complaint. And you see Chinese begin to act like demanding political consumers in the ways that are possible for them. So I'm reasonably confident that the Chinese government is, if it is going to grow more prosperous, will also be forced by Chinese themselves to grow more liberal. The second thing, but it's a great social science experiment we are running. The second thing is that per capita GDP in China is $8,748, which is fantastic, but it's the rough equivalent of Equatorial Guinea. It's not the equivalent of South Korea. It's not the equivalent of Japan. It's not the equivalent of Germany. So China has been a magnificent manufacturing base for precisely the kind of thing that has put my Uncle Eddie out of a job as a United Auto worker, right? They are the manufacturing base of the world right now. As Colin points out, they have not been stewards of that in a way that is encouraging Apple computers to manufacture things in China. So you begin to see the ebbing away of international investment, especially in the kinds of services and high up the value chain kind of production that drives the G7 economies. So whether China can get through this middle income trap without all of the rest of us stopping to help them is actually a second open question. And the third very good question you raise is, but Europe. We have had the luxury of not caring about Europe because after the end of the Cold War, it was the world's safest place. And that is less true at the moment, given Vladimir Putin's behavior. And you begin to see, so for all of President Trump's angry, anti-European, you have seen greater investment militarily, greater investment financially in the security of Europe by the United States in the last 18 months. Because we can afford to ignore Europe and pivot to Asia if Europe's stable and secure. But too much for us in terms of the people we like in the world and in terms of the thrumming of the American economy actually requires a stable, prosperous Europe. So we are now slightly recalibrating, and I think you'll see more of that. And also Europeans are recalibrating, right? Every NATO ally in the last 2.5 years has turned the corner and is now increasing its defense spending again, because they're nervous too. And 5 NATO allies are putting brigades of troops into the Baltic states because we're worried enough about Russian behavior.
Thank you. James Starkman. What would you, both of you, think of the current and possibly near future status of the national security apparatus as it pertains to the Justice Department and the FBI?
I don't have much to say about that.
So I think this is a time of enormous strain on the checks and balances in American democracy. And I'm thrilled that for the most part, they are succeeding with flying colors. I actually think President Trump's behavior has activated the antibodies against him being able to, for example, politicize the Justice Department. But I am genuinely worried about it. I mean, President Trump succeeded with the first immigration ban in doing something I would never have thought possible, namely he made an ACLU member out of me. Because I was shocked at my government's behavior and wanted to both support the governmental rule of law that is essential to democracy in America, but also the active, vibrant civil society that holds our government accountable for us. And I think I always think I'm the median American voter, right? That what I do, everybody else does. But I think in this case, I'm 2/3 of the way convinced that Donald Trump, for all of his efforts to undermine the rule of law in the United States, is actually going to end up being good for democracy in America, because he is reminding us of all of the things we take for granted, the norms of comportment of our elected leaders, that we need to actually demand of them and not take for granted that these things happen automatically. And that's a source of enormous vibrancy in American society.
Sir, great. Sure, just like get the microphone too.
Thank you. Enlightening comments. Fotis Poliakis. The JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, what was the timing about canceling it and the connection to North Korea? Was it something that he did not want it to be used by North Koreans, and that's why he canceled it before the trip? What was the meaning of it?
So, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So you have just proved yourself a better strategist than the President of the United States, because they actually weren't connected, and ought to have been. What drove the timing on canceling the Iraq agreement, the Iran nuclear agreement, was the President would have had to certify that Iran was in compliance with its obligations under the agreement, and that remaining part of the agreement was in America's national interest. Everyone in the administration, including Dan Coats, the Director of National Intelligence, Mike Pompeo, the Director of Central Intelligence, and Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, had testified before Congress, again to those great checks and balances of American democracy, had testified that Iran is in compliance with the terms of the agreement. The president, however, had campaigned on leaving the Iranian nuclear agreement. And the best guide to what Donald Trump is going to do is actually what he campaigned to do. I think that's how to understand the personnel changes of the last 6 months, that he was tired of feeling like he was being hemmed in by people who didn't win an election in this country and were trying to prevent him doing what he told the American people he was going to do. And that is, frankly, to his credit. Congress had, you will remember when the agreement went into force, President Obama didn't deign to get it approved by Congress, and Congress, not trusting the president's overarching desire to get an agreement with the Iranians and the European countries, had required every 6 months for the president to certify that not only was Iran in compliance, but that it was in America's interest. And that's what that latter part was what President Trump was unwilling to do.
I'll just add to that. I mean, there was a serious case against the deal. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it couldn't get through Congress. It wasn't capable of winning 2/3 support. Now, it's harder to get out of than to get into, but I mean, Iran really has taken that time to take advantage of the sanctions, continue to push the envelope in the region, support terrorism, support its proxies. I mean, we were told that one of the benefits of the deal in 2015 would be that it would trigger domestic changes inside Iran. You know, what happened in the meantime is Iran became more aggressive. So I think there was a valid critique of the deal and also a valid debate over whether or not to exit. Now, you can imagine being against the deal in 2015 and then saying, well, I think it's still very difficult to get out of. One of the big
Secretary of Defense's position.
Exactly. So there are, you know, there's different nuances that people have taken. One of the questions, because Trump is not risk averse, he's willing to gamble that Europeans will have to go along with it, that European companies will have to go along with it. So Europeans don't like it, right? They don't necessarily have to like it, but Trump's threatening them and saying, you know, it's not just the US, it's major European companies will be threatened if they try to continue to do business with Iran. I think one other short point is, it may have been intended, I don't know, I mean, there's a variety of stories, but to give Trump a little more leverage going into the North Korean negotiations today, which is to say, we are willing to walk out of arms control deals that we don't like. So don't think that we'll just have to say yes to anything, right? That's a possibility.
Let
Maybe just for concluding to our discussion or this open part, Colin, taking that last question of gamble and asking both of you to address that question, which is the president's willingness to take risks. I think experts generally tend to be more risk averse in that. They can think of second and third order effects where things can go wrong. Just your speculation, do you think these gambles will pay off? That the G7 gamble, that Europeans, you don't like it, but do you want to deal with Xi Jinping and Putin? Go right ahead, or you can take the gamble with North Korea. You may not, we want you to denuclearize. If you don't want to play ball, we still have the, fire and thunder option, perhaps, in reserve. I mean, this sense of gambling, where do you think it might end up?
Well, and that's exactly what it is. The Trump foreign policy experiment is a gigantic gamble, which is why a lot of people weren't willing to get on board in 2016. The DC policy community tends to be more risk averse than that. So Trump said a lot of things. A lot of it was actually quite vague when you get right down to it. I mean, he said NATO was obsolete. He didn't lay out a detailed policy platform saying, I will dismantle NATO. And as it turns out, he hasn't, right? As Kori suggested. In fact, he's reinforced it in some ways. There's more of a US military presence on the ground in Poland and the Baltics than there was 2 years ago. But he's willing to push the envelope on multilateral trade, arms control, with adversaries, with allies. And I think all you can say, I mean, we're not soothsayers. All you can say is keep an open mind. Keep an open mind. He may actually pull off some wins. There may be catastrophic consequences. It's actually too soon to say. And I'm very skeptical of people who claim, after even a year and a half, that they know for a fact how it will end up. I mean, when I read the 1,000th article saying, inevitably, it's all a disaster and it's going to be a disaster, or everything's great, it's like the Lego movie, everything's awesome. I would take either one of those with a grain of salt. We have to wait and see. Most of this hasn't actually played out yet. It may be a mixture of the two. My impression of Donald Trump actually is that he is not interested in major military conflicts overseas. I mean, he says repeatedly, I want peace. He wants peace with everybody. He wants peace with Russia. He wants peace with North Korea. He's willing to threaten bloody murder to get it, right? So he's not risk averse in that way. But he's risk acceptant in terms of pushing the envelope on specific policy outcomes to get what he wants. I don't actually see somebody who's hell-bent on war. That is not my impression. He is a very blunt New York businessman who thinks that the US has been ripped off and that he's the guy to readjust the situation. That's not somebody who's necessarily looking for war. Now, we could end up in war unintentionally. That's a big danger. That's a danger at any time. It was a danger in 1950 in Korea. But I would just withhold judgment if you can and actually empirically watch and see what happens before concluding that it is all terrific or that it's all a disaster.
Last word, Kori?
I agree with everything Colin's just said. I mean, this is the reason 85% of what I know about this subject, I know from reading Colin. I had the fun of writing, so I read a column for The Atlantic, and I had the fun of teasing through the other day this issue of risk tolerance and risk aversion. And many of you I know Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory, right? The notion of what makes for winning streaks and losing streaks, which is that we have different levels of risk tolerance based on whether we're winning or losing, right? So how you get a winning streak is once you start to win, you're confident and you then make safer and safer bets. And so you win more because the probability of a good outcome is higher. And it's the inverse. If you start losing, you start making bigger and riskier bets because you want to restore what you have lost. And I actually think that's where the president is on foreign policy. I think he looks to me like his risk tolerance is growing with time, that his risk tolerance on the first serious strike was less than his risk tolerance on the second serious strike. His willingness to alienate America's friends is accelerating, not decelerating, because he's not getting the outcomes he wants, right? Like, he wants Angela Merkel to stop scolding him, and she's not, and therefore he's getting more outsized reactions to her. And so I am actually more worried than I think Colin is, although I take his very good point that we need to judge the president on outcomes. So for example, if you think the outcome on the Iranian nuclear agreement is, as the president rightly surmised, we can force Europeans into compliance because nobody can afford to be outside the dollar market. But if that makes Europeans unwilling to keep fighting alongside us in Afghanistan or joining a war on the Korean Peninsula if we start one, that's a pretty big downside risk. And the resentment that our closest friends in the world feel toward us right now actually also matters. And the third thing is, if the Iranians restart their centrifuges, which if I were a betting man, I would bet that the footsies they are playing with Europeans is if Europeans don't continue to abide by the agreement, i.e. not fold to American secondary sanctions, Iran's going to restart those centrifuges, and then what do we do? Or here's my last bad outcome, because I'm someone with a grisly imagination, which every good strategist is, right? Like you always have to imagine the monsters under the bed, which is the erosion of dollar primacy and creation of a new SWIFT system, which the Chinese and Russians are playing around with and could be an enormous problem for us, which will be the function of us overusing secondary sanctions.
Thank you, Kori. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. And thank our speakers.